Somewhere in a scrapyard or the back of a barn, there is an engine block with a name cast into the iron. Buda, Harvey, Illinois. For 70 years, that name meant an engine you could trust with your life. It pulled fire trucks to burning houses. It moved the tractors that fed the country. At its peak, a Buda engine ran in nearly 30% of the trucks on American roads. Built by a company that was, by some counts, the second largest engine maker in the entire nation. And then the name was gone. Not in a crash, not in a fire. The story you have heard about companies like this is that foreign competition killed them. That is not what happened here. What happened to Buda is stranger and quieter, and it began with a single signature on a single page. Here is the part that should bother anyone who ever built something with their hands. Buda did not fail. Its engines did not fail. The men who designed them did not run out of ideas. The plant in Harvey was still running, still shipping, still trusted, the day the name on those engines started to disappear. So how does a company that powered a country simply vanish while it is still standing? That answer starts in a small railroad town that most people have never heard of, with a foundry that made tools for the very tracks that built America. The town was called Buda, Illinois, and it gave the company its name. In 1881, a man named George Chalender founded the Buda Foundry and Manufacturing Company there, making equipment for the railroads. That was the business of the era. The country was laying track faster than it could count the miles, and every mile needed tools, hardware, and parts. Buda made all of it. But the town of Buda was never going to be big enough for what Chalender had in mind. A small town gives you a name. It does not give you a future. Picture what a foundry actually did in those years. Men poured molten iron into sand molds and pulled out the hard parts a railroad could not run without. Couplers, hand tools, the frogs and switches that let one line cross another. It was hot, dangerous, exacting work, and it demanded a kind of knowledge that lived in the hands of the men who did it. A casting that came out wrong was scrap. A casting that came out right held a train together under tons of moving steel. That was the discipline Buda was founded on, and it never really left the company. Long after it stopped making rail tools, Buda still thought like a foundry. Get the iron right, or do not bother making it at all. By the early 1890s, the company pulled up and moved to Harvey, Illinois, just south of Chicago, where the rail connections ran in every direction. That move changed everything. Harvey was not simply a better address. It dropped Buda into the orbit of one of the most industrially dense regions on Earth. Chicago and the towns around it were thick with foundries, steel suppliers, machine shops, and a workforce that understood metal the way farmers understand weather. Raw material came in easily. Finished product moved out fast. A company that had been making railroad tools in a quiet town suddenly had the suppliers, the labor, and the shipping reach to stop thinking small and start thinking like a serious engine builder. And that is exactly what it became. By the early 1900s, the country was entering the age of the internal combustion engine, and Buda decided to plant itself at the center of it. The world was tilting. Horses were giving way to machines. Farms needed mechanical power. Roads were filling with trucks. Railroads needed lighter, faster vehicles to inspect and maintain the lines. Every one of those needs came down to the same thing: an engine. Buda looked at that landscape and made a decision most companies never have the discipline to make. It would not build trucks. It would not build tractors. It would build the engine and let everyone else build the machine around it. It is worth sitting with how unusual that choice was. Most ambitious companies want their name on the whole machine, the thing the customer sees and points to in a showroom. Buda wanted the part nobody saw and everybody depended on. There is a builder's logic in that, the same logic a good machinist lives by. Do one thing and do it better than anyone else alive. A truck maker had to worry about cabs and frames and axles and sales lots. Buda worried about one question asked over and over: Will this engine still be running when the man who bought it is too old to drive it? Everything the company did for the next half-century flowed from that single, stubborn focus. That distinction was the whole strategy, and it was a smart one. It meant Buda's customers were not in one industry. They were in every industry that needed power, and in the early 20th century, that was nearly every industry there was. A company tied to a single product lives and dies with that product. Buda tied itself to the one part that no machine could do without. The opportunity was enormous, and the timing could not have been better. Consider the country Buda was selling into. In the span of a single generation, America went from a place that moved on hooves and steam to a place that moved on gasoline and diesel. A farmer who had plowed behind a mule at the turn of the century could, within 20 years, be sitting on a tractor that did the work of 10 animals and never needed feeding. A city that had run on horse-drawn wagons was suddenly full of delivery trucks. Every one of those machines was a customer waiting to happen. And every one of them needed the same thing Buda had chosen to specialize in. The company had picked the one part that the entire mechanical revolution could not do without. By 1907, Buda was building gasoline engines for railroad motor cars. These were not glamorous machines. They were the workhorses of the rail world, small and rugged, carrying inspectors down the line, moving crews between yards, handling the unglamorous daily work that kept the railroads alive. They ran in heat and in cold, on rough track, in places far from any help, where a breakdown was not an inconvenience but a real danger. They were maintained by men who needed them to start and run without drama. And they did. That is how a reputation gets built. Not in an advertisement. One engine at a time, in real conditions, under real pressure. Every mile a Buda engine ran without failing. Put another word in another man's mouth. Mechanics talked. Purchasing managers compared notes. Fleet operators asked what the other operators were running, and the answer kept coming back the same. Buda. That kind of reputation is slow to build and almost impossible to fake, and it is even harder for a competitor to break. By the time Buda walked into the truck business, it was not introducing itself to strangers. It was walking into rooms where people already knew exactly what it could do. From there, the engine went everywhere. When Kenworth began building trucks in the early 1920s, its early models commonly ran on 4-cylinder Buda engines, and that relationship carried into the 30s, when Kenworth offered Buda 6-cylinder engines as well. Kenworth would go on to become one of the most respected names in American trucking. In those first years, Buda was the engine behind it. Fire apparatus came next. Seagrave used Buda engines. American LaFrance used them too. The fire trucks racing to protect American cities had Buda under the hood. And in agriculture, Buda powered tractors from builders like Oliver and farm machines beyond them. Here is a detail worth holding on to. The Oliver 80 was one of the most recognizable row crop tractors of its generation, and it could be ordered with a Buda diesel option. Fewer than 150 of those diesel units were ever built. Today they are so rare that collectors hunt for years to find one, but their rarity is not the point. The point is what they prove. A major tractor maker building a flagship machine trusted Buda to power it. That trust was the company's entire identity. A tractor without a dependable engine is an expensive piece of iron sitting in a field. A freight truck with an engine that quits at 300,000 miles is a liability, not an asset. Buda understood that the engine was the one component no manufacturer could afford to get wrong. And it built everything around being the company that got it right. That reach across so many industries was not luck. It was structural protection that most of Buda's competitors never had. A fire truck builder and a tractor maker and a railroad were not competing with each other. They were all looking for the same thing, an engine they could trust, and Buda could serve all of them at once. When one industry slowed, another was usually growing. The company's fortunes were never chained to a single market. At the height of the First World War in 1917, the Harvey plant employed around 2,400 workers, with roughly 1,500 of them working directly on engines. By 1922, even after the war boom faded, the plant still employed about 1,900 men. By the mid-1920s, Buda was turning out a wide range of engines in many sizes, serving trucking, agriculture, fire apparatus, marine, and industrial work all at once. By then it was far more than a supplier. It was the engine underneath a real share of American commercial life. Think about what 2,400 jobs meant to a town like Harvey in 1917. It meant a main street full of shops that lived on Buda paychecks. It meant fathers who brought their sons through the gate to learn the trade. Families that measured 3 generations by the same plant whistle. A man could walk in at 18, learn to read a casting and run a lathe, and walk out 40 years later with a pension and a set of hands that knew exactly what they were worth. The plant was the spine the whole community was built around. When a place like that is healthy, nobody thinks twice about it. It is only later, looking back, that people realize the plant had been holding up everything around it the entire time. If you ever ran a machine that had one of those engines in it, or worked a line that built them, you already know what that reputation was worth. Tell us in the comments what you ran and where. Because the next part is where the ground starts to move. The industry was not standing still, and neither was the engine itself. Gasoline had built Buda's name, but heavier trucks, harder work, and longer hours were pushing the whole market toward diesel. A diesel engine pulled stronger from down low, sipped less fuel, and held up under the kind of all-day load that broke other engines. Buda could see the shift coming, and the question that hung over the company was simple and unforgiving. Could it carry its hard-won reputation into the diesel age before the bigger players locked up the future? For a while, the answer looked like yes. In the 1930s, Buda licensed a diesel combustion technology from the Lenova Corporation and began building what became known as the Buda-Lenova diesel engine. The Lenova design used an indirect injection chamber with a small energy cell, where the fuel ignited to create a high-pressure blast that forced a controlled double swirl of turbulence back into the cylinder. The result was a burn that was smoother and quieter than almost any other diesel of its day. For the work Buda was already serving, it delivered remarkably refined and reliable power. It was a deliberate, intelligent move into a technology that was about to reshape the entire industry, and Buda made it early. The company saw where things were going, and it adapted. For the men who actually ran these machines, that mattered more than any spec sheet. A diesel that pulled hard from low speed meant a loaded truck could climb a grade without the driver nursing it the whole way. Better fuel economy meant a fleet owner could run his routes for less and keep his doors open another year. Durability meant an engine that worked all day, every day, under load, and asked for nothing in return. Those were not abstractions to a fleet operator in 1938. They were the difference between making payroll and missing it. Buda had spent 50 years learning exactly what those men needed, and the Lenova engine was its answer. For a company that had built its name on engines that simply did not quit, the move to diesel was a promise the company fully intended to keep. Then the war came, and for a moment it looked as if Buda had secured its place for good. During the Second World War, the company fed its Harvey plant into the war effort, building diesel engines to demanding military specifications, tested hard before they ever left the floor. Buda engines went into military locomotives and into the scout cars and support vehicles that moved an army across 2 oceans. The plant ran flat out from 1941 to 1945, and from the outside, Buda had never looked stronger, or busier, or more essential. Buda diesels went into diesel-electric locomotives that the army shipped to Africa and to Europe, hauling supplies behind the lines that kept the war moving. They went into scout cars, the fast armored vehicles that ran ahead of the columns. Every one of those engines had to start the first time, in desert heat or in winter mud, because a stalled engine in a war zone was not a service call. It was a man in danger. Buda met that standard, the same way it had met it on the railroads 40 years earlier, with engines that simply ran when everything depended on them running. But wartime demand is a kind of mask. It made Buda look bigger than it had ever been, and it hid how exposed the company had quietly become. As long as the orders kept coming, nobody had to ask the hard question. The orders kept coming, and when they finally stopped, the mask came off. That moment, when the wartime orders ended and the real shape of the market showed through, is the hinge this whole story turns on. If you have ever watched a strong company get caught flat-footed by the world changing around it, you have seen this before. Leave a note below about the place you saw it happen. Stay with us, because what came next is the part almost nobody tells. Once the war ended, the market stopped rewarding a company simply for being reliable. It started rewarding whoever could move fastest, scale widest, and pay for the next generation of engine before anyone needed it. That was a fight independent builders almost never won. The conditions that had let Buda thrive for half a century, a scattered market, loyal customers, and limited competition, were ending all at once, and they were not coming back. The new world had names. Detroit Diesel had introduced its 671 engine in 1938, and by the post-war years, it was becoming the dominant force in commercial diesel. It was a two-stroke design, simple to maintain, durable, and backed by the deep resources of General Motors. Cummins was building a reputation in long-haul, trucking with engines that ran strong and economical over hundreds of thousands of miles. Caterpillar was moving into diesel, carrying the weight of a company that had been building heavy equipment for decades. And Buda was lined up against all three of them as an independent company with a single plant in Harvey, Illinois. The imbalance was impossible to miss. Detroit Diesel had General Motors behind it. Cummins had deep relationships with the major truck makers. Caterpillar had a dealer network that stretched into nearly every county in the country. Buda had its reputation, its engineering, and its loyal customers. For a while, that was enough. But the market was consolidating fast, and the companies that survived consolidation were the ones with the deepest pockets and the longest reach. The age of the standalone engine company was closing, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. This is the part the bumper sticker version of history gets wrong. The companies pulling ahead were not winning because they had better engineers. They were winning because they had resources Buda could not match. Detroit Diesel could fund years of development on a new engine and absorb the losses while it waited for the market to catch up. Cummins could build deeper ties with the major truck makers and tighten its grip on the customers that mattered most. Caterpillar could put trained technicians and spare parts within a day's drive of almost any operator in America. None of that was an engineering advantage. All of it was a structural one, and structural advantages compound. Every year a larger rival spent widening its distribution was another year Buda fell further behind in reach. Every new engine platform a well-funded competitor developed was another product Buda could not match without capital it simply did not have. The gap did not open all at once. It widened slowly, the way these things always do, until one morning the distance was too far to close. Buda had not changed. The industry changed around it, and a company that had once been perfectly placed was suddenly standing in the wrong spot, holding strengths that had been built for a market that no longer existed. Its engineers still knew how to build a reliable engine. Its customers still trusted the product. None of it was enough. And there were men inside that plant who could feel it before the numbers said it out loud. An order that used to be automatic now went to Detroit or to Columbus instead. A truck maker that had run Buda engines for 20 years quietly started fitting someone else's. The Harvey plant still hummed, the iron still poured, The engines still left the floor as good as they had ever been. But the phone rang a little less often each year. For a workforce that measured its worth in the quality of what it shipped, that was a strange and lonely kind of pain. There was nothing to fix. The engines were not the problem. The world had moved the goalposts, and no amount of craftsmanship could move them back. And underneath all of that, a quieter problem was eating away at the foundation. The very thing that had made Buda's diesel special was turning into a weakness. The Lenovo system was an indirect injection design. It worked beautifully at moderate speeds, but it was being outclassed by newer direct injection engines that squeezed more power from every drop of fuel, ran more efficiently, and were simpler to build. Catching up meant a major investment in a new design, and the investment required money that an independent engine company of Buda's size was increasingly hard-pressed to raise. Every year that passed without a modern direct injection engine was another year the high-output designs from Cummins and Detroit Diesel pulled further out of reach. The distinctive feature had become a liability, and fixing it cost more than the company could spend. Then came the decision that ended Buda as an independent company, and it did not come from inside Harvey. In 1953, Alice Chalmers acquired Buda. The reason was almost coldly practical. Alice Chalmers needed a diesel engine supply of its own because its previous supplier, Detroit Diesel, was a division of General Motors, and General Motors had just bought its way into the heavy equipment business, turning a supplier into a direct competitor overnight. Buying Buda solved that problem in a single stroke. What was a clean strategic move for Alice Chalmers was the point of no return for Buda. 70 years of independent identity, of building engines under its own name for its own customers, ended with that transaction. Buda did not choose this. It arrived because the company had been squeezed from every direction at once, by competitors it could not match at scale, by a technology it could not afford to replace fast enough, and by a market that had quietly reorganized itself around companies far larger than Buda had ever dreamed of being. The acquisition was not a rescue, it was an absorption. And this is where that engine block from the beginning of the story comes back. Almost immediately, Alice Chalmers began rebranding the engines under its own label. The Buda Lenovo models were rechristened as Alice Chalmers diesels. The distinctive Lenovo combustion system was phased out in favor of direct injection, and from a pure engineering standpoint, that was probably the right call. But think about what it meant. A man on the floor in Harvey, who had spent 30 years casting and machining engines that wore the Buda name, watched that name come off the iron. The plate that said Buda, Harvey, Illinois, the one cast into the block, was replaced by another company's badge. 70 years of identity, unbolted and set aside. The Harvey facility did not close. It simply became the Alice Chalmers diesel engine plant. Buda's disappearance came without a collapse and without a fire. It was administrative. An industrial empire folded into another corporate identity almost overnight, and the name that had taken 7 decades to earn was erased in a matter of months. That is why you can hold a Buda engine in your hands today and still struggle to find the company in any history book. It did not blow up. It did not go bankrupt in the streets. It was quietly written over, and a written over name leaves no ruins to photograph, no shuttered gates to stand in front of. It just stops appearing. There is a particular cruelty in that for a company whose entire worth was its name on a piece of iron. There is one last turn, and it carries its own bitter logic. The company that swallowed Buda did not last either. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Alice Chalmers was battered by the farm crisis, by rising competition from John Deere and International Harvester, and by mounting losses it could not stop. By the mid-1980s, it was selling off its farm equipment business, and in 1987, Alice Chalmers filed for bankruptcy. The agricultural division was sold. The construction division was sold. The Harvey plant, the one that had been Buda, passed through a string of owners until the assembly lines finally went silent for good. And the Buda name, already faded into a footnote, slipped the rest of the way into the background of industrial history. So when you ask what killed Buda, the honest answer is not a villain in a boardroom twirling a mustache. It was scale, it was capital, it was a market that decided the independent engine builder was a luxury it no longer needed. It was outgrown, then absorbed, then overwritten by forces it had no way to fight. The men in Harvey built engines good enough to power a country. The country just stopped having a place for the company that built them. They do not make them the way Buda made them, and part of the reason is that the company allowed to make them that way could not survive the world that came after. And yet the engines themselves refused to disappear. Walk through enough farm auctions and antique tractor shows, and Buda still turns up. An old power unit driving a saw rig, a marine engine pulled from a fishing boat and bolted to a stand. An Oliver 80 diesel, one of the fewer than 150 ever built, restored by a man who spent years tracking down parts that no catalog lists anymore. The men who keep them running are often the same men who watched plants like Harvey go quiet, and they restore these engines for a reason that has nothing to do with money. It is a way of refusing to let the work be forgotten. The company is gone from the history books, but the iron is still out there, still starting on a cold morning, still wearing a name that a corporation tried to erase and never quite finished erasing. If this story stayed with you, do something for the men who built those engines and the towns that grew up around plants like the one in Harvey. Leave a comment about the place you remember, the line you worked, the name stamped on the iron you trusted. Tell us what it built and what it cost when the name came off. Stories like this one only stay alive when the people who lived them speak up. So share this with someone who would understand it in his bones. And if you want more of these, the empires that rose on American hands and the quiet decisions that erased them, follow along and stay with us. We read every comment. We are listening, and we are not going to let these names disappear without a fight.